But all right, so I think you've painted a fairly clear picture. Let's get to the central point that caused me to focus on your work and brought us into this conversation. When I saw the attacks, my first thought, literally, was, how is this even possible on that border that it could be breached by so many people simultaneously? One would have expected, if an attack had been successful, that the number of people who got through initially would have been small. You know, if 5 people had gotten through out of a military force of 100 and had done some damage, that would certainly be noteworthy and would be considered an embarrassing failure for the IDF and the security services of Israel. But to have hundreds get through and operate barely impeded for, was it a full day almost? This seems like it is not, if somebody submitted it as a script, you would say that is implausible. And so it did lead me to wonder what could possibly explain such a failure. Incompetence seems inadequate to explain it. Now, you're in a position to say more about this because you have manned that border.
Yeah. It's very hard for me to talk about it because it's there are so many friends and family members of friends that are missing and have been taken hostage in this barbaric acts, that talking about what I know sometimes feels like, why is this important now? And at the same time, I know that if we don't talk about this, then we will just let them off the hook once again. Because to me, and I will explain why I think this is a great atrocity. Because to me, this is, it's, I don't know how to say it. It's just the people of Israel have been, I don't know if sacrifice is too rough of a word, but we have been sold and sold out completely, and no help for hours and hours, and no military involvement, no police, no arms on the ground for hours and hours. This is something that is non-typical and unusual for Israel Defense Forces. Now, I've served in the military forces 25 years ago as I was in the intelligence forces based in the Gaza Strip, as I told you. And I know the security drills. When I served, there was no internet. So I would sit next to the phone in my shift of the fence of the security of the Gaza Strip. And whenever something would move alongside the fence, I would get a phone call from the human observers that are looking at the gate, telling us there is a chain of command that you have to notify when something like this happens. And then straight away, forces come in to look at what is it and take it down.
So what do you mean when something moves by the fence? How small is something?
It can be a pig. It can be a cat moving alongside the fence or touching the fence or trying to cross the fence, an animal. They would identify it. They would see it.
So a cat gets scrutiny.
Would trigger. Yeah, it could trigger the fence. Yeah.
And
an animal.
25 years later with
internet and with the most sophisticated high-tech weaponry systems like drones, like there is a special system, I don't know how to call it in English, it's called seeing shooting. That's a literal translation from Hebrew to English. Seeing shooting. It's a robot that sits on top of a tower looking at the fence, and whenever something triggers the fence which has sensors on it, it's supposed to shoot. It's like automatic, right? And there are drones and there are helicopters and there are troopers on the ground. And, there are many things that are supposed to be activated. There are various lines of defense and layers of defense that are supposed to be activated when something like that happens.
Okay, so I just want to make this clear. I mean, it probably is, but you have a system that is sensitive to anything the size of a cat or bigger. That system, since you were manning it, has had 25 years to mature and become more sensitive, to become more discerning. And yet, how many places was that border breached?
15.
15 places
If not more.
simultaneously?
Yeah. 15. And that is completely ridiculous, because normally with one breach of the fence, the whole army is triggered and things
Immediately,
start
presumably.
moving immediately. Things start moving immediately. And here there was nothing for hours. And so I want to talk about some of the explanations that have been given so far. There are some unbacked. I have to say that these explanations are unbacked by any evidence or proof so far, but they have been thrown out to the air or to the mainstream media. It started with Iranian cyber attack that took down the IDF tech infrastructure that was running around for a while. Okay, that because they took down the IDF technology infrastructure, there was no way for the technology to operate.
All right,
I
let me just
I think it's
immediately,
highly unlikely.
even if it was true, one would imagine that, especially, was it within one day of the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, there is a cyber attack that doesn't result in every person being called up simultaneously and placed on whatever border is most likely to be breached under those conditions?
Yeah,
I mean, wouldn't it?
that's of course, that's why it's completely unlikely. And what about the backup systems, and how come? And then I'm asking myself, okay, if this is true, then how come all the civilian infrastructure was still working? We had no problem with any other infrastructure, just the IDF one was hurt. This just doesn't add up. And then it moved on to the narrative of a takedown of the observer lookouts, including the human observer soldiers that were there. They said that the terrorists came into the bunker and just murdered or killed everyone. We still don't know if this is true or not. But that
That
was
would
the
seem
next.
like a simple factual question.
Yeah, and we don't know. There was no explanation or fact released to us about that. It was just a
And
rumor.
again, were such a thing to have happened, I don't think you need to be a military strategist to imagine that the next thing you do is marshal an overwhelming force to the area that has just been blinded by the murder of the people manning the border. And yet
Correct.
that did not happen.
No, it did not happen. And then you get some other soldiers talking on social media, tweeting on social media, saying that leave the observers alone. They were heroes. They did notify. They were there, and they notified the forces that they were supposed to notify, but no one answered. So again, who know? It's again another contradiction. We don't know. And then the next thing that happened, it was this morning when I received this information that Air Force pilots shared stories on their Twitter account. It's in Hebrew, that they were up in the air fighting and protecting already 45 minutes after the breaches. Now, that is, I'm sorry to say it like that blatantly, that is a lie, because we have people on the ground in all the different villages in the Gaza envelope area around the Gaza Strip, that they see every movement in the sky. Whenever there's a helicopter or a jet or anything, they know there was nothing for hours in the sky. So why would the Air Force pilots now tweet and say, we were there within 45 minutes fighting and taking down terrorists? No, they weren't. And
So
so these narratives are being thrown out to the air. There is no official statement about any of these that I told you about. It's only in the public discussion. And the administration is not even trying to give us any answers. They're saying we're fighting now, we'll talk about it later kind of approach.
Yes, and unfortunately that has an eerie ring to other events.
Yes,
It's almost as if whatever arranged this, and let us agree that at the very least this was not Hamas acting independently. They were at least backed by Iran, and that suggests that there were at least regional forces in play, possibly global forces. But whatever it is that arranged this, there is a component on the Israeli side that is mysterious, and there is no effort being put into an explanation that could possibly satisfy anybody with, let's say, your level of understanding of what took place there. These are transparently inadequate explanations being offered, and the only defense of them is that to entertain any alternative possibility will be dismissed as conspiracy theorizing.
Correct. And what you're saying is so true that it's actually happening. I will explain in a second. I just want to say something about what you said about Iran. I'm not sure that Iran is behind this, although the mainstream media, Wall Street Journal, is saying that they are.
Isn't Iran saying that it is?
Iran is not saying that it is. The president of Iran is actually saying, we are not behind this, but we kiss the hands of Hamas for doing what they did. We support them, but we are not behind this. Now, that is complicated. And the thing is, just because I'm a journalist now and I try to be factual, Israel does not have any evidence at the moment that Iran is behind this. So we just have to hold that. Okay, I want to be careful because we don't know. It may have been, by the way, a Hamas soldier that was captured by the Israeli Defense Forces now in the last couple of days. In his investigation, he said that they were working on this drill for 1 year. They were planning and preparing for this for 1 year, and that they were shocked that the IDF did not show up until 5 hours later. And he said another thing. He said that they were the one. I mean, he said it was their initiative. He didn't mention Iran at all. He said that they were working on it with 1,000 soldiers. Now, as I said before, Hamas did grow to really big dimensions, and they do have a lot of weaponry and a lot of sophistication, and they should not be disrespected in terms of military power. And so it is possible that they did it themselves. The only thing I would speculate is that they were supposed to come in and do a smaller scenario, a smaller event. But since they bumped into this party, they did an ISIS trick that didn't end well. That's what I speculate. I don't know if it was planned to be that big as it was, and very gory. And I have really gory descriptions, which we will not go into. But I don't know if they had planned all of what has happened in such detail.
Well, if I put together the pieces that I've seen, and again, I am no expert in what takes place in the Middle East, but there are two contradictions here, or two implausible claims. One, that the failure at the Israeli border was organic. There is at least not a sufficient explanation that is on the table yet that would explain both the failure of the detection and the failure, in the absence of the detection, of an overwhelming force showing up immediately. One of those two things.
Mm-hmm.
If the detection failed, the IDF should have shown up in force immediately, and the fact that it didn't suggests two failures. But the other thing I want to point out is that Israel is now devastating Gaza.
Yes.
It is claiming to be bombing the sites in which Hamas conducts its operations. To say that this operation, which was being planned for a year and was massive, went undetected. And now to be claiming that, in fact, they are being, that it may look to us like they're blowing up apartment buildings, but that's because there's a weapons factory in the basement. That suggests a high level of knowledge of where these actions are actually conducted, and a high level of knowledge and a long period of planning in which the attack was not anticipated. That is simply incompatible.
And that's the other thing about my military experience. I was in the intelligence forces. The shift I told you about picking the phone and knowing what happens around the fence, that was only one time a week. All the rest of my time was in intelligence work. So I know how the system works in terms of knowing about every little step that Hamas is taking in the Gaza Strip. We have human informers and, many other tactics to know what is happening in the Gaza Strip. I don't need to go into the details. People who see spy movies know, but it all exists. And so for 1 year, this has been planned, and the Shabak or the 8200 or whatever, the intelligence forces did not know, the Mossad did not know of anything. Highly, highly, highly unlikely. Okay. And then you said something, you mentioned something about they are supposed to bring in the forces, even if there were so many breaches. Where were the forces? So I want to answer to that. The Gaza division was actually moved to the Judea and Samaria area near Jerusalem almost in its entirety. 60 to 80% of this battalion was moved to that area. Some of the most professional battalions in the IDF were moved there to secure illegal outposts in the Samaria and secure a member of parliament in a village called Hawara, a Palestinian village, because it's one of those member of parliaments that likes to provoke. And, he's a settler. He wants to be there in the middle of a Palestinian village. And so he needs protection from the army. And so a lot of, that's one of the things about the current Israeli administration that has a lot of ministers or members of the parliament that are extreme. It's right wing, like they're settlers and
Hardliners.
Yeah, oh, completely. And so they're very provocative, and they demand a lot of protection from the army, from Benjamin Netanyahu, and he succumbs to that, to their demands. And so a lot of the forces that were supposed to be around Gaza were not there.
And this, I would point out, again, I don't think you have to be a military strategist to figure out why you wouldn't want to move that entire force. Even if you had to borrow half of it, you would certainly leave the other half there, and you would leave them in an activated state because there's a diminished capacity. That does not seem to me like that requires a tremendous amount of understanding. The other thing is to move that force on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War seems preposterous.
Correct.